I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Jay Bilas to Questions for Cancer Research today. Jay was an awesome player at Duke and played a huge role in helping Coach K establish the program. Jay also received a law degree from Duke and somehow finds time to practice law when he's not covering college basketball for ESPN. Jay, how are you?
Doing great, Chris. How you doing?
I'm doing great here. We really appreciate you being on here. I got to tell you, I'm awfully impressed that you managed to get a law degree from Duke while working for Coach Gay. Coach O'Toole told me about the long hours the staff would put in up there.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't the easiest thing I've ever done, but I'm glad I did it. It was a lot of fun. I enjoyed every minute of it.
Yeah, I can bet. I bet. Jay, let's start with your alma mater. I've mentioned previously in a couple of interviews that Duke lost 7 players from last season's Elite Eight team to the transfer portal. To say that about Duke's program is pretty astounding, but I guess it fairly reflects just how much things have changed in all of college sports. To put this in perspective, let's bear in mind that for the class of 2028, Duke received 54,000 applications, of which 5% or 2,800 were accepted. Ultimately, the players, their families, and advisors have to gauge the value of a Duke degree against the potential to earn an exorbitant NBA salary. It wouldn't surprise me if all 7 players felt or advised that they had NBA potential and/or they opted for a bigger NIL payday at another program. You understand as well as anyone just how valuable Duke education and degree are. What's your take, Jay? Are players becoming a little too short-sighted in the current environment?
No, I mean, there are variables. They differ for every player. So some of the players that Duke lost had been there for quite a while and were not certain of their roles coming back. You know, Jeremy Roach went to Baylor. I don't know whether he got more money, but money is just one factor of many. And a number of players wind up getting a degree at one place and going to another and pursuing a graduate degree. So it's not that all of them are giving up a Duke degree, and you can stay there for a number of years and finish your degree somewhere else, and it's still a Duke degree. And I know that happens in other places, and I've had some personal experience with that within my family. And then other players leave because they know they're not going to play. That's a big part of it. And no matter how much you like the school or the team or the environment, if you're not going to play next year, or you may play a far lesser role than you considered when you went there in the first place, that's going to affect your happiness and your fulfillment with playing. I know it would have with mine. So look, for every student, money is a factor. It was not allowed to be a factor for an athlete until recently. Just like with you or with me, if we're offered a job somewhere else, money is not going to be the only reason we take a new job. Now, if it's an overwhelming amount of money that dwarfs every other consideration, maybe we take it. But if it's just more or within the ballpark more, you're going to say, well, I'm happy here, or I like this, I like that. There are reasons to stay, and certainly for every player, reasons to go. My only advice to players is once you make a commitment for that particular year, you need to be all in for that year. You know, you chose to be there, they chose to have you, and you need to give it everything you have that year. And at the end of the year, just like most of us do, we can evaluate where we are at the end of a year and then make a decision that's best for us. And the school can certainly make a decision that's best for them. This is not a one-way street. Schools have decided for decades when they wanted to move a player along. You know, that's never publicized when a coach comes in and says, look, it's time for you to move on. Because that's not the entire transfer portal. It aren't the players deciding. Sometimes it's the coach deciding, you know what, you need to go. And that doesn't get the same amount of publicity. I'm not saying it's widespread or it happens in 50% of the cases or whatever, but it happens, and it's always happened.
Yeah, I mean, that was the question I had for you. I think when you and I were in college and we signed, I guess, letters of intent back in the day, I think we pretty much figured, hey, it was a 4-year scholarship unless you had academic or disciplinary issues. But I think for the most part, you were entitled to 4 years there in most cases. And that has certainly, I would think, changed a lot, right? I mean, there's got to be coaches saying, hey, this got to be a two-way street, right? We've got all these guys leaving. we've got guys who are underperforming or just not performing as expected. I mean, I would think if the rules don't change, you're going to see more and more of coaches saying, hey, we really like you, but it's time for you to move on.
That's been said since this whole enterprise started. Coaches have said that to players.
Yeah.
Look, when you and I were in school, they weren't 4-year deals. Your letter of intent bound you to the school, but it didn't bind the school to you. So the school, it was a 1-year renewable. So your scholarship had to be renewed every year by the school. If the school decided not to renew it, you were SOL. I mean, you had to, and if you had to go somewhere else, you still had to sit a year out, even though it was the school's decision not to renew your scholarship. That was really the issue. Is coaches back then could say my way or the highway because there really was no highway. If you left and transferred to another school, you had to sit out a year, and that transfer restriction existed only in 5 sports: football, men's and women's basketball, baseball, and hockey. Every other sport could transfer and be eligible right away. That's why the NCAA came up with the transfer portal. They knew how ridiculous their transfer policies were, and it was hurting them in court when they were arguing over money, over amateurism. And so they came up with this transfer portal. I think the transfer portal overall works fairly well. I think it could be better regulated. They could get some of the windows a little bit better. But if schools really want to retain their assets, meaning the players, they need to start signing them to contracts. You sign them to a contract, then you've got some certainty, and so does the player. But until that happens, until the NCAA allows schools to directly pay players, which they don't allow right now, we're going to see this for a while. And plus, years ago when you and I were in school, there weren't as many landing spots because transferring was so difficult. There weren't as many openings at other schools. So it wasn't like you had quite as many options as you have now. But you hear a lot of things. People say, "Oh, X amount of players go into the portal. They don't get a scholarship." A lot of those players, or at least a significant number of those players, were kind of walk-on end of the bench guys anyway. So it wasn't like they were coveted players when they left. So that has to be factored in as well. We're going to see. Look, it's not the same as it used to be, but it used to be horribly restrictive on players. People are starting to having to get used to the fact that players now have some rights. They don't have full rights, but they have some rights now, and they're exercising those rights. And I think that's nothing but a good thing, because the retention rate for athletes is much higher at schools than the retention rate for regular students. Regular students transfer at a higher rate than athletes do.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think especially at Duke. I mean, you go back before the portal kind of came into existence. I always felt for the kids at Duke. A lot of these kids might have been McDonald's All-Americans, very, very highly touted players. And it was almost like, hey, if these kids aren't playing as freshmen, I mean, they could just get buried there for 4 years. So, I mean, that was always pretty tough. And you didn't see a lot of those kids transfer out. And maybe it was just too hard of a restriction to actually sit a year out. But I do think in this case it provides a lot of fairness to those kids who are sitting there saying, "Hey, I may never play here." I mean, look at this freshman class that's coming in, and they may just keep doing this for the next 3 years.
Yeah, it happens, but there have been more players than perhaps people would realize that have transferred out of Duke in years past, and some of them transferred, went somewhere else, and went on to the NBA. So your point is well taken. It's a difficult place to find minutes because the talent level is so high. Same's true of Kentucky or North Carolina, other places like that. But now that money is a factor, you're seeing some players transfer because they do get more money, and there's an argument to be made from an economic standpoint that that's how it should be. Another school is willing to pay more to have Duke's 5th best player as their best player, and so they've got more resources to pour into that. Just like you're not, if things work the way the NCAA told us they did all these years ago when they were touting amateurism, then you'd see all the best coaches on one coaching staff because they could pay the most. That's not what's happening. And when they told us that the rich were just going to get richer, that's not happening either. We don't have enough data yet to really make a conclusion. But look at all the upsets you're seeing in football now that you didn't see in the past. Heck, Vanderbilt just beat Alabama for the first time in forever, and but you're seeing more of that It's not all the time. There's still an imbalance. There's never going to be competitive equity in college sports because they don't do any sort of revenue sharing. And you can't expect 120 football teams to be competitive with one another. And you can't expect 350 basketball teams to be competitive with one another. But everybody's chasing the money, so those divisions are bigger than the numbers say they should be.
Got it. Love it, Jay. Let's take you back a few years to your high school days. I was able to watch a recent discussion with the current Duke basketball team, which was published online. It was really good. I took note that you told the players that as a high school student growing up in Los Angeles, you chose Coach K and the opportunity to build a top level basketball program and not necessarily the school. You, along with Mark Allery, Johnny Dawkins, David Henderson, and Weldon Williams, joined a struggling Duke program as members of the class of 1986. You and your teammates instigated an amazing turnaround of the program that culminated in a 37 win season and a tough loss in the championship game to Louisville in your senior year. Coach K would go on to win 5 national championships at the school, and Duke remains a perennial powerhouse under current coach John Shire. Your decision to attend Duke was awfully astute for a highly recruited high school senior from LA to make. How did a relatively unknown Coach K at that time convince you to join him at Duke?
Yeah, it's a good question. I did not have a good relationship with my high school coach. None of the players on the team did. And so when I started being recruited, I quickly realized at 17, 16 years old, whatever it was, when I started getting recruited, that going to college was probably the only time in my basketball life I was going to get to choose who I played for. I didn't get to choose my high school coach. And I didn't get to choose any coach that I played for professionally or in any other context except for when I went to college. And it was a decision I wasn't going to screw up. And so I came down to 4 coaches that I liked the best. It was Coach K at Duke, Lute Olson was at Iowa at the time, Jim Boeheim at Syracuse, and a gentleman named Ted Owens, who was the head coach at Kansas at that time. Those were the 4 coaches that I liked the best. And it wasn't, I'm not sitting here trying to say it was a no-brainer, the easiest decision I ever made, because it was really difficult. But there was something about Coach K, how honest he was, straightforward, the connection I had with him, that made me say, you know what, it's him. I want to play for him. And look, I was just like, I'm sure any other high school recruit, that when I came home from a visit, that's where I was going. I'd just been there. I was enamored with what I'd just seen and who I was with. And I was like, okay, I'm going to Iowa, or I'm going to Syracuse, I'm going to Kansas, whatever it was. But after the smoke cleared and I had some time to think about it, it was Coach K. And I committed early. I committed, I think it was December of my senior year of high school. And that was considered early back then. There was no early signing period. You signed in April. There was one signing period for basketball, but I wanted it over with. I knew, and I did not like being recruited. I just didn't like all the phone calls. I didn't like the hard sell stuff. I didn't like it from any of them. Like I didn't want to talk to Coach K on the phone 3 nights a week. I did not enjoy that. When I knew, I was done, and I told them. And as soon as I told them, I called the other coaches, and it was a weight lifted off my shoulders. I had a great senior year, in large measure because I think I got that kind of behind me and didn't have to think about it anymore. I knew where I was going.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, listen, Coach K was under the gun at that point. Really, came under the gun, later in your career. But I mean, there obviously he sold you. I mean, did you have many doubts when you showed up there that, hey, we're going to get this done? I mean, you never know for sure, but you must have really believed in his vision.
I did believe in it. But when you're 17 or 18, you're kind of stupid and giddy. We didn't even consider that it wasn't going to work out in our favor and that we weren't going to have a great team and be great. And even though we did talk about, the idea of building, helping build a program that was going to be sustained, and be great into the future, that wasn't our primary focus. Our primary focus was we wanted to be good for us. The other stuff would kind of take care of itself. But we did take great pride that when younger guys came in, that we were role models for them, and we wanted to bring them in and help them. And I think we did a pretty good job of that. We were very mindful that we helped in recruiting, and to Coach K's credit, he really listened to us when he brought recruits in. He asked us, "How did you like this guy?" And I'm sure there was a talent level where the guy was so good he didn't care whether we liked him or not.
Yeah.
But he listened to us, and he recruited a lot of guys that fit what he was doing and what we were doing. And so everything was seamless in that regard. There was nobody he brought in that you weren't going, man, that's a great guy. Now, how good of a player, that all worked out. We there was, to a person, everybody that was brought in, we were like, man, this guy's great, fits in great. So that was actually a lot of fun. It was never it was ultra competitive, but never from a jealousy standpoint. Like, nobody was ever worried about. I think it was because everybody was confident that they were willing to let it fly, and whatever Coach K and the staff decided we were going to roll with. But it was a great group of guys that it doesn't matter whether the incoming player was a freshman when we were seniors, our group was seniors, or anything in between. Those guys remain the best friends I have in the world now. And I don't think that's really an accident. It was because of the culture, I think, that Coach K established from the jump.
Yeah, no, just and literally the rest is history. I mean, just a great decision by all you guys, and what you did there was incredible, and just an amazing program. Jay, let me just feed out some information, and then we're going to borrow your legal skills here. This summer, it looked as though the NCAA had reached an agreement to settle 3 outstanding antitrust lawsuits for about $2.8 billion. Under the terms of the agreement, former Division I student athletes going back to the class of 2016 would be paid retroactively, and current and future student athletes over the next 10 years will enter into NIL agreements with their schools. The settlement is subject to the approval by the student athletes and the presiding Judge Wilkin. The anticipated timing is for current players to be paid by their schools next year. It's a revenue sharing agreement that would likely see power conference schools pay their athletes somewhere between 22, 23 million in the year one, or approximately 22% of sports revenues. We've seen some pushback from Judge Wilkin on collectives, and we now have the legal team which successfully sued the NCAA in the O'Bannon versus NCAA NIL lawsuit, voicing their opposition to the settlement terms. And no one seems to be sure how Title IX will factor into all this. Jay, I'm wondering if the odds of this settlement being in place by next year are somewhat diminishing.
They may be diminishing a little bit, but I still think it's going to get worked out. It's I can't sit here and tell you it's a perfect deal, because I don't think it is. I'm not a big fan of swapping out one restrictive wage ceiling at 0 for one at 22%. But 22% of revenue is a lot better than 0. So I think there are some real positives to it. I do think we'll move to a system in the future where the schools will just be able to sign players to contracts, and perhaps we'll get to a point where there's collective bargaining with the players, and the players can agree to it and shield the NCAA from antitrust scrutiny. But look, the NCAA in college sports is a multi-billion-dollar entertainment industry that's run off college campuses. Every other multi-billion-dollar industry in the country seems to be able to handle the federal antitrust laws just fine, and the NCAA is going to have to do it too. And they haven't done it. They've been operating, truthfully, illegally for decades now, and the courts finally caught up to it. And I was recently with an NCAA administrator I respect greatly, a former commissioner, that said, over that period, the law didn't change, but the narrative did. And while I respect the judgment there, I don't really agree with it. The idea somehow that a narrative changed, it didn't change. That's like saying if you go to issues of race or gender, that the law didn't change on separate drinking fountains, but the narrative did. If you look at it that way, it sounds kind of silly when you say that.
Mm-hmm.
The NCAA needs to pay people. They need to pay their employees, and they need to do it in a way that's legal. And you mentioned Title IX. Look, there are a multitude of schools right now that aren't complying with Title IX. So, like, I hate to break this to the NCAA, but you have to comply with federal law. Figure it out. And it's funny, nobody brings up Title IX when coaches get paid or when they sign multi-billion dollar media rights deals. But now the players get paid. Now we're all worried about Title IX. They'll figure it out. And it's really not that difficult. But the NCAA still wants to make it difficult because now, instead of dying on the amateurism hill, now they want to die on the employment hill. And all these schools have countless, well, it's not countless, you can count them, but they all have tons of student employees right now. I mean, you know, the University of North Carolina has 6,000 student employees. You can't tell me they can't figure out how to pay 500 athletes as employees if they want to. All the NCAA has to do is remove all restrictions on schools paying their athletes, and we're done. It's not that big of a deal. They'll all figure out how to do it. If Duke wants to pay everybody the same, do it. If North Carolina wants to pick and choose which athletes they're going to pay more, I mean, what I would suggest is look at it this way: who is policing how many minutes athletes play in games? Why isn't all equal? Because they all work just as hard. Like, why shouldn't the walk-on play just as much as the best player? Like, why shouldn't the walk-on Spencer Hubbard at Duke play as many minutes as Cooper Flagg? He's at every practice. He works just as hard. You know, that's ludicrous to say that. So why would you expect them to be paid the same when their value to their team is different? You know, the coaches aren't all paid the same. You know, John Shire makes more than any of his assistants. You know, they're not having fights in the locker room. They operate just fine. I mean, people understand meritocracies. They understand that it's not a big deal. And you want this to be seamless, then sign them to contracts and everybody knows what they're getting. It's a recognized market. It's not as hard as we're making it.
Look, it's a big number for the NCAA, and I don't know how much money they have in their coffers. I certainly understand there would be a huge risk for them to go to trial, and with antitrust, you get treble or triple damages. I mean, that could have been really big trouble for them. But I guess the question that's out there for somebody like me, somewhat of a casual observer, a fan, can the NCAA possibly agree to this settlement without some sort of protection against new antitrust litigation, which I guess would come from Congress? And I know there's been some discussions there. Any updates for us there?
The NCAA is still lobbying Congress to try to get an antitrust exemption, basically, to have Congress pass a federal law that would preempt all the different state laws that the NCAA is having to deal with regard to athletes being compensated. To me, I think that's going to be really difficult. In my discussions, I've been on Capitol Hill a couple times, and in discussions mostly with congressional staffers, one of the big questions is, whatever we pass, how are we going to enforce it? Congress is not going to let the NCAA enforce any law that it passes. And the federal government doesn't want to take this on and have to oversee it. So, you know, look, it's not an area where I think the federal government, frankly, belongs, but that's not my call. You know, good luck telling the federal government where you think it belongs. It's gonna belong where it says it's gonna belong. But I don't think it's a good strategy for the NCAA to try to beg Congress for help. I think this is all within the NCAA's ability to fix if it wants to fix it. It just doesn't want to. That's basically the bottom line. And they keep pleading poverty. How can all these billions flow through the system and they claim that they're not making any money? That's nonsense. It will at some point cause different decisions to be made. Now that players can be compensated, then you're going to start saying, well, do we need an athletic department this big? Why do we need all these administrators? Do we really need 21 athletic directors? Do we really need this much staff? And the answer is going to be no. And especially if private equity is getting into every major sport now. It's in the NFL, NBA, you name it. It's going to get into college sports. And as soon as private equity starts dangling the kind of money that we're talking about here in front of schools, they're going to take it. And private equity is going to go in there and say, you need to cut these expenses. There's no reason for you to have all this. It's not necessary, because then you're going to start messing with their income stream. And so we're going to see an adjustment of where the money goes. And coaches may make less, administrators may make less, there may be less of them. But one thing for sure is the most important thing in winning in any sport is players or the athletes. We see that in professional sports. You see it everywhere, on every level. You know, you can lose with great players, but you can't win without them. And we've seen when schools had said, well, we're never going to do this. We're never going to pay our athletes. They're paying them and they're competing for them. And they're competing at a very high level to get the best players because they know that their success hinges on whether they have the appropriate talent to win.
So it sounds like at the end of the day, you think the final answer could be, despite what the NCAA and the schools say, that these kids should ultimately all be employees of the school. You know, I mean, I think everybody signing a contract, I mean, that's pretty much free enterprise right there, right?
Yeah, and it should be. Like I don't see how difficult, why this is difficult. Not for you, but just for the NCAA. You know, the idea that you know they pay coaches and sign them to contracts, and nobody complains that, well, East Carolina doesn't have the same amount of money to pay their football and basketball coach that North Carolina has. This isn't fair. This isn't fair. They're not. Nobody's saying that. Everybody pays what they can. Um, Schools are going to have access to better players, everybody, if they're allowed to pay. Look at it this way, like just from an economic standpoint. So Kansas and Wichita State, right now they don't recruit the same player. Or before NIL, they don't recruit the same players. Wichita State's not going to get any player that Kansas is recruiting. But now maybe Wichita State can marshal the resources to pay Kansas's fourth best recruit more than Kansas can pay. And so maybe that fourth best recruit says, you know what, I can be the number one guy at Wichita State and make X more than I could make at Kansas. That's more attractive. So it's another variable that makes Wichita State more of a player for better talent than it could have had otherwise, if that makes sense. And what we're seeing with the mobility of players is that players that came out of high school and were underappreciated, under recruited, whatever you want to call it, they go and they do really well at a quote unquote mid-major school, and they're able to transfer up and play under the biggest spotlight. Why? Because of how they're pegged out of high school, should they be limited, if you will, to that for their entire career? They shouldn't be. And then you've got other players that maybe overshoot their talent and go to a Power Five place, don't play, and then transfer to a mid-major level, and then blossom into stars and wind up in the NFL or the NBA. It happens. So, like, people find their level, and why should they be restricted or have to give up a year of their life based upon that kind of decision? I've just never believed in that, and now we're at a point where we're seeing it. But like you mentioned before, you used Duke as an example. If some player values a Duke degree more than a bigger payday or more playing time, then stay there. Everybody's got their own decision to make, just like every coach. Some coaches decide to be assistants at big time places instead of a head coach at a smaller school. There are a lot of different avenues to get to your ultimate destination, and players should be allowed to experience that as well as everyone else.
All right, Jay, love it. Thank you so much. Let's turn a little bit to the selection committee. I know how much you love golf. I'm going to give you a quick golf quote, which is one of my favorites. I think one of the all-time great golf quotes came from the USGA's Sandy Tatum. I know you've heard this before. When talking about the brutally tough conditions at the 74 US Open being played at Winged Foot, Sandy said, "We're not trying to humiliate the best players in the world. We're trying to identify them." Great quote. I'm sure the players didn't like it that much. But it makes me wonder, what's the ultimate goal these days of the NCAA basketball tournament committee? Are they trying to identify the best teams in the country in February, March, or are they solely looking for teams that perform the best over the previous 4 months? Historically, the NCAA would typically not differentiate between losses and wins in early December or late February. In the current transfer portal area, college basketball has never before experienced the level of roster turnover that we're seeing today. I'm not sure that the tournament committee is identifying the best teams if they place a fair amount of weight on early season losses when teams are trying to gel and find their identity. I think it's fair to say that some tournament caliber teams in March will in no way resemble the teams that they were in November and December. What are your thoughts? And do you think the tournament committee is making any concessions in this area?
Well, it's a really good question. Look, it's a hard target to hit. So I feel for the tournament selection committee because it's not easy. They're doing a lot of things. They're putting the tournament on. They're selecting officials, sites, all this stuff. So it's not just a selection of teams. And do I think it's a bit difficult to ask a bunch of college administrators that are running conferences and running their own schools programs, ADs and the like, to have to watch basketball games the way I do? Yeah, I think that's a lot. And do I think they're all as qualified as can be? I don't think they are, but that's not a knock on them. It's difficult. But to your question, I think the selection process is as fair as you could possibly imagine. Like, every team in America has the exact same path to the tournament. They can win their automatic bid, which each conference decides how to award their automatic bid. Each conference gets one. They can have a postseason tournament like almost everybody has. They can do it by the regular season champ. They can arm wrestle. They can pitch pennies. They can flip a coin. They can do whatever they want with that automatic bid. Most of them have a postseason tournament. So what each team has to do is win their automatic bid against their peers, the schools they chose to be in a conference with. Right. So once that's decided, whether you like the outcome or not, then everybody goes into a big pile and they take the best teams from there to round out the field. So the question becomes, of the at-large teams, the ones that didn't win their automatic bid, what does best team mean? And to your point, I don't think, I agree that I don't think it's necessarily the right thing to look at a November game the same way you look at a March game. It's different. And I do think with the analytics that we have in place and we have the ability to use now, you can place a value on the game at the time it's played. In other words, you can play the number one team in the country and lose in double overtime. And that's a better performance than 90% of the wins that were had by other teams that played. So can you place a value on that game that's independent of whether you won or lost? And by the same token, you can play a ranked team and both teams play horribly, and one team's going to win. So it looks like a good win, but you played horribly and they played horribly. So can you place a value on the performance? That's not independent of winning or losing, because that's important. But the win or loss is not the only thing. And I don't care for. There's one thing that the tournament committee does that I do not care for at all, and that's the reliance upon non-conference schedule strength. Who cares? If it's your complete body of work, why do you care what your non-conference schedule looks like? It's your overall body of work. So if you play in a really tough conference and you have unbelievably difficult games in your conference and your non-conference schedule isn't as challenging, who cares? It doesn't matter. Similarly, what difference if you play in a lousy conference? Do you get rewarded for it because you played a tougher non-conference schedule? That's just, to me, that makes no sense. So I don't like teams being excluded based upon, well, they didn't challenge themselves in the non-conference. Like, who cares? They win enough games against quality competition for you to identify that they're among the best teams. Like last year, I thought Pittsburgh got screwed, and they got screwed on the non-conference strength of schedule front. But reasonable minds could differ on that. And again, like, everybody's got the same bite at the apple by winning their automatic bid. After that, then you bring all these variables in and you put it in the hands of the committee. Overall, I think the committee does a really good job overall. But there are certainly quarrels that you have with the committee every year on particular decisions. But when you have a committee, look, I'm a big believer that committees should always be odd numbered, and 3 is too high of a number. I prefer a benevolent dictatorship, but
Yeah.
that's not realistic with regard to to selecting postseason teams.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think at the end, I'm not criticizing the NCAA, right? I mean, we have things changing at warp speed. But at the end of the day, right, we all want to see the best tournament, right? I mean, I want to see the best teams playing in the NCAA tournament. And I think if you just go back to last year, it's maybe as an extreme example as you get, with NC State making it to the Final Four, right? I mean, I don't think they get into the tournament if they don't win the ACC tournament. I think going into the ACC tournament, they'd lost maybe their last 3 conference games. But here it goes to show you, it probably took these guys a full season, which is in most cases would have been too long to kind of come together. But at the end of the day, they were one of the best teams in the country.
Yeah, but there's a similar argument that they just got hot. So, you could, it depends on how you look at it. So I agree with you. But if we really want the best teams in, if we want the best teams, if we can take the 34 or whatever it is automatic qualifiers, and then the 36, if we can determine who the whatever the number is, the next best teams after that, if we can determine the top 40 at-large teams, we can get all the way to 64. They can determine who the best teams are. We don't have the best teams in because of automatic qualifiers. Like, there are a number of these automatic qualifiers that are just cannon fodder for better teams and get blown out. Now we have the occasional upset, and that's great. People seem to be moved by that. I don't think if we had the 64 best teams, the tournament, or 68, whatever you want to call it, I don't. If we selected the best, we'd just go with 64 and just have one tournament instead of having this first 4 thing with 8 teams, trying to get into the main draw, because most people don't pay attention to the tournament until the 64 team draw starts. But if we really wanted the best teams, we'd take the 64 best teams, and we wouldn't deal with this automatic qualifier stuff. Even football is struggling with it. Like, they cannot get away from, instead of just taking the 12 best teams and scheduling the tournament that way, their 12-team tournament, they're gonna give the top 4 spots to the 4 power conferences. Winning a conference championship, they think is so great, when you might have the top 4 teams are in the SEC. Is that the right thing to do? I don't know. Whatever they put out there, people will consume. We had a crappy system for a long time where football really thought they could pick the best teams. Like, we know who the 2 best teams, they don't know. And we don't know in basketball. You have a record, you believe that it goes a certain way, and you have a certain way of doing it. But we don't know who's going to win these games. We never have known. We don't know. And that's what competition's about. But baseball, they thought, what are we doing the wild card for? And then wild card teams started winning the World Series. Same thing in football. The Raiders, I think in 1980, were the first wild card team to win the Super Bowl. We didn't think that was possible. People thought, it was ridiculous, watering everything down. It doesn't water it down. It's great. And but you have to ask yourself, is it worth it? Would we be better off having the best teams in? But there seems to be a pull for, we don't want to take away the opportunity for some Cinderella when in first round games the margin of victory has grown, not shrunk. But look, it's great. It's a great tournament. Nobody ever has a problem with it. And as soon as the selection process is over, we argue about it for 2-3 days and have a good time, getting all upset about it. But as soon as the tournament starts, nobody remembers all that stuff. We just move on to the competition.
Yeah, let me give you one more on the tournament selection criteria. There was some commentary, maybe even criticism last season on the part of ACC coaches that the Big 12 teams were somewhat rigging the efficiency ratings used by the selection committee by scoring some huge blowouts against lower level teams early in the season, kind of what you were getting at before with these non-conference games. I don't know if that's a good thing for the game in terms of overall sportsmanship, and it takes away the opportunity for reserves and walk-ons to get some game time, which I think they deserve. However, with all the money at stake, I don't think that we'll see a change without some type of action from the NCAA. There could be a ton of big blowouts upcoming in November, early December. What do you think about this?
That's sort of going back to judging the performance versus the margin. So margin of victory is a metric that is useful. I mean, it's not without its use. But look, I don't think we should do anything based upon we want to get walk-ons playing more. To me, that's not a determination. That shouldn't be a determining factor, or even a factor in trying to determine who's the better team. But when you have a game decided, should we be worrying about the margin, or should we be encouraging a program to keep their starters in longer? I guess the answer to that is probably no for most reasonable people. But at the same time, I mean, am I going to argue with a coach that says, you know what, I want to play my starters more because I want them playing together more, and because we're beating the hell out of this team, why should my best players be limited in the stats that they can put up or things like that? What if it determines whether, or should we be considering whether a great player playing more could be the all-time leading scorer at his or her school if they're not playing in the second half of a blowout? I mean, who gets to decide that? But we're clearly seeing coaches trying to, I don't want to say run up the score, but try, playing toward those metrics because they count and they could be a difference maker if there's a close call at the end of the line or in seeding. And that's all part of it. Like the metrics and analytics have become part of this entire enterprise. So the committee shouldn't be surprised that people are studying what they do and then playing to it. That's what they want them to do with regard to scheduling. They say, well, we want to encourage teams to play better schedules, so we're leaving Pittsburgh out because they didn't challenge themselves enough in the non-conference. Do I think past performance should be an indicator? Yeah, I do. Should it be the be all and end all? No, but you can't tell me like if UConn at the end of the season, we're not going to factor in they've won the last two and they've won 12 straight games by double digits. Somehow we're going to doubt them because they had a couple injuries in November and lost a couple games. I don't think that's a very smart way to do things. But whatever, kind of like I said before, whatever the committee's benchmarks are, we're really talking about teams at the end of the line. Like they make a mistake in seeding, that could really negatively impact the tournament because they've done that in the past and it has negatively impacted the tournament. But still, it's still a great event. And I think it was my former AD, Tom Butters, that said one time, you can play your way out of a bad seed, but you can't play your way into the tournament if we screw up and leave you out. And that's, I think that's selection is probably number one, but that's always an end of the line thing. We're talking about the 35th best team in the country, whether they get in or not, or the 40th best team, whatever it is. If you're ranked 50 and below, you're probably not going to get in.
I get you. Jay, let me just go back and revisit something because I did want to ask you about the player contracts, and I know you got into it a little bit earlier. So I know you love the freedom that the players have. You think it's more equity for the players to be able to move in and out. But you would propose for maybe 2-year contracts for the players. You think that's kind of reasonable for them to stay in place, and then we have the buyout options, or you don't think it's even should be 2 years?
It's whatever the school wants. If they want to sign, if Duke wants to sign Cooper Flagg to a 1-year contract with an option for a second year because they know unless he gets injured, he is not going to be in college for very long because of how good he is, then sign him to that. If you want to sign a guy to a 4-year deal, go ahead. You can put a buyout in there. You can have a clause, a behavior clause, where if the player gets arrested, you can terminate the contract, or you can have benchmarks for academics. You have to have 95% class attendance, or we can terminate the deal. Whatever you want. But at least then the player can negotiate at arm's length with the school. I mean, we don't have any standardized contracts for coaches. They can put whatever they want in there. And that can help, clear up the NIL thing. If you're paying a certain amount of money, you can say to a player, all right, here's the shoe you're going to wear. And we're gonna own your NIL. So if you want to do something in the NIL space, you have to get our approval to do it. We don't want we don't want something where a guy's doing gambling commercials. Okay, so but you have to pay for that, right? Just like they would have to pay you or me. ESPN signs me to I have an exclusive contract with ESPN. There are things we negotiated in there that I can and cannot do. When I was playing professional basketball, there was a clause in my contract that I couldn't water ski and skydive and play football or all that. I couldn't do those things in the off season. Otherwise I'd risk my contract. Those are, and that happens in the NBA, the NFL, all those contracts have that stuff. You could certainly have a standardized deal if you wanted, or a model contract that schools could use. But these schools are pretty, Duke has 30,000 employees. They don't have one standard contract for everyone. They know how to hire people. They're not sitting up at night going, geez, do we pay the landscape professional the same as the president of the university? Like, how are we going to figure this? They don't do that. It's not that hard. And they know what the players are worth. They know what they're willing to pay, and they know who to recruit, who to put in the game when they want to win, and who they give a uniform to. They know all that stuff. It's not difficult.
Awesome, Jay. Let me keep you moving. I got two quick ones for you. And the next one I'm pretty curious about. I want to get some information on this. So I watched the ESPN documentary, The Class That Saved Coach K, a few times. Really, really well done. I know you're involved with that. That was really entertaining. I'm always a little surprised to hear that you guys would play with the Carolina guys in the off season. It's certainly understandable given the proximity of the schools and the high quality of the talent, but still, it was Duke and Carolina. Did you play a fair amount in the offseason with them over your years at Duke?
Yeah, we would go up there. It was usually preseason. I don't remember doing it a ton after the season was over, like going up there in April or something, because the school year was ending, and we don't. Back then, you didn't stay for summer school unless you were in academic trouble. You went home. Everybody went home. Now the players stay year round. They work out during the summer. They go to summer school, things like that. But you didn't do that back then. At least it wasn't common. But yeah, before the season started, practice used to start October 15th. So in September, we used to go to Carolina for a week, and they would come to our place for a week, whatever it was, and we just play pickup games. And it was usually us versus them, rather than kind of interspersing players and all that stuff. So it was really fun and competitive. Some of the players knew each other better than others, but we got to know guys through doing that, and I made some really good friends. I mean, Matt Doherty and I are still really good friends. Brad Doherty, we got to know all those guys. With Joe Wolf, I was a teammate. Joe just passed away, sadly, a couple weeks ago. But we got to know those guys really well. Some of the guys knew them already, but it's not like today where the AAU circuit was as firmly entrenched. It was more regional back then. You played in a couple national tournaments, but I didn't know those guys before I got there. And especially being a West Coast guy, I didn't even know some of my teammates who grew up on the West Coast. So it was a different time, as pre-internet, but it was really fun and really competitive. Guys don't play pickup like they used to, and it's just not the same kind of environment as it used to be.
Yeah, it's funny. I think it was probably the summer after my freshman year at Iona. Mark Jackson and Chris Mullen would come up and play some pickup games from St. John's. And I remember after one of the games, I think Chris Mullen had just been at the Pan Am trials, and he was saying, guys, he says, I know you guys all know Michael Jordan, but he said, you guys can't believe how good he is. And, everyone was like, yeah, well, we kind of know how good he is. He said, no. And I remember the statement he made. He said, Michael Jordan's going to be better than Dr. J. So, you can remember that was probably 1984, and guys were just like, what, better than Dr. J? That's just never going to happen. And, certainly we know what went on. But you played, you obviously played against Michael in some pickup games and at Carolina and Duke. I mean, no one, I guess, could have predicted that he was going to go on and get to the level that he did. I mean, how big did you think his upside was for the NBA, when you were playing with him in college?
We knew, now, did we know greatest player of all time kind of stuff? Who could wrap their head around that? I don't think that was in the thought process, but we knew he was going to be an NBA All-Star and All NBA and all that stuff. Everybody knew that. After you played against him, and he's just different. And there were a few guys that were like that, like Ralph Sampson, Mark Price, and Len Bias. The guys you played against, you're going, this is a different level, man. So it was very well known how good he was. But heck, when you were at Iona, Gary Springer was there, and Steve Burt and all those guys. Those were, Gary Springer was a great player, but there's just a different. I don't know how to. I'm sure it's like you mentioned golf before. I'm sure it's for golfers. You got all these great golfers, and then you see Tiger Woods hit a golf ball, or Jack Nicklaus or something. That's different. That's not normal. And you can bang balls all you want to. You're never going to hit it like Tiger. And you can work out as much as you want. You're not going to be like Jordan. It's just a different animal.
Yeah, no, he was so much fun to watch. Let me hit you real quickly on the collective. So pay for play collectives were supposed to be out, and it looks like the judge has come back and said, no, no, I want pay for play collectives in there, um, which I guess is a very good thing for the players. Now, I guess the thing that's always struck me a little bit funny about collectives and other people is basically it does set up a system where there's no limit as to how much a player can be paid, which is pretty incredible, right? I mean, this is still college, and I think I know what your answer is going to be because you've been very pro player in all this, but I just wonder if the collectives have no limit as to what they can pay a player, how much of it is coming down ultimately to, well, our boosters are more powerful than yours? What do you think about that?
The same as I think when schools would build gigantic facilities when the schools weren't allowed to pay, and they just created a better environment that was more attractive for the players. Like, what are we going to do? Like, what are you going to do? You can tell them, no, you can't build a nicer facility. I mean, we could fix this tomorrow if the schools would just revenue share. Like everybody throw their money in a big pot and it's doled out equally, and then we'll see who does a better job with their money, just like they do in the NFL or the NBA or things like that. You could have a salary cap and all that stuff, and they could decide, hey, here's what we're going to do, but you just have to collectively bargain it. I think what the judge in the Ninth Circuit, Judge Wilkin, is really saying is if you're going to put restrictions, you better be careful. Like she's not in favor of arbitrary restrictions and limiting what a player can make out in the marketplace is an arbitrary restriction. Now, there are limitations in the NFL and the NBA because they've collectively bargained with the players. They're essentially in partnership with the players, but the players in those leagues get 50% of the revenue. Now, that's not happening in college. They want to start paying 50% of the revenue to the players. I'm sure the players will sign on the dotted line and accept that. But just like I go back to John Shire signs a contract with Duke. He can't wear whatever he wants, but they buy that right of exclusivity from him. That costs them money, and that's all in the contract. So you can do that with players. You can limit what they make out in the marketplace, or you can say, hey, you can't do this ad or that ad, or you can't accept money from these places because we're paying you, and you're going to agree to this. You can certainly do that if you want to, but absent that sort of contractual relationship, I don't think the players should be telling. I don't think the schools should be telling the players what they can and can't do. They're not telling any other student. Like nobody's saying, hey, we've given you an academic scholarship, therefore you cannot accept anything from anyone else. You cannot work. You cannot, if you're a musician and you take a music scholarship, you cannot perform for money anywhere because we've given you this scholarship. Nobody does that, but yet we do it in sports and we think it's okay, and it's not okay. It actually is illegal, and now it was allowed for a long time because the courts didn't catch up to what this administrator called the narrative. But they know now, and if the NCAA wanted this to be amateur, they could have run this like Division II or Division III all these years, but they didn't. They ran it like the NFL and the NBA. And when you do that, you have to imagine that the players are going to ask for their fair market value. And over the years they have, and they're going to get it at some point. They haven't gotten it yet, but they're getting closer to it, and they're ultimately going to get it.
Yeah, so just to go back a little bit on the 22% of the revenue sharing, I take it you're not in agreement with the people who say, well, when you take into consideration the scholarship and other benefits, it basically comes out to 50-50. I take it, I have
No,
heard that argument, but
and it's nonsense. It's nonsense
nonsense.
because think about this. So what they're saying is the athletic department is paying, right? So who does the athletic department pay? They pay the school. So the school's not out a nickel for that scholarship. It's just that money is moved from one university account into another. That's like me saying, well, my house here, boy, I got my kids living in the house and I've got to pay for that. So I'm going to take the rent for that one, the rooms that my kids have, and I'm going to move that from my right pocket to my left pocket. And now my right pocket is empty because I paid my kids rent, but I paid it into my left pocket. It's still in my pocket. That's what the schools have been doing and saying. is because the athletic department is paying it, that somehow it floats off into the ether. They're paying it to the school, and they're also paying all these other expenses to the school, like food service and maintenance on facilities and all that stuff. That's going to the school. The school's doing the maintenance, and the school gets paid an exorbitant price for the maintenance that they're providing. It's one big accounting game. And look, if you want to tell a player, hey, we're giving you this scholarship, therefore we're not going to pay you as much, go ahead and see how it works out. Because another school is going to say, you know what, we're going to give you the scholarship and we're going to pay you what you're worth. Go ahead, try it that way. Or if another school says, hey, the scholarship is enough, so we're going to give you only a scholarship, and our degree is worth so much that that's all we're going to give you. See how it works out for you, and see how many players you sign as a result of that. That's a free market approach. But if you want to have it the same for everybody, and sort of a limited amount that you can pay players, then you're going to have to bargain for it with the players, and they're going to have to agree to it.
All right, one last question on that, and boy, I'm almost scared to hear the answer, but so the boosters now are involved with the collectives. Now, if a kid goes on an official recruiting visit to a school, are boosters now allowed to give that kid cash while he's visiting? I mean, kind of used to happen back in our day, but obviously it was a no-no, but we know it happened. I mean, are they allowed to actually give these kids cash now?
No. The collective thing, there's still sort of a facade of how you have to do it. Like it is pay to play, but say you sign pick a play. Well, we were talking about Duke. So Cooper Flagg is their #1 recruit. So say Duke says, all right, the Duke collective says to Cooper Flagg, we'll pay you, pick a number, $1 million, pay $1 million. For that $1 million, you have to make 10 appearances at $100,000 a piece. So you have to work in a soup kitchen for 3 hours. So you have to give a speech to the Blue Devil Club, or you have to do this or that, or work Habitat for Humanity. You can do whatever you want, but the player has to essentially earn that money. Now, do you think that that's worth $100,000 an appearance? Doesn't matter what you think. They're able to cover themselves that way. Now, I don't know that's what Duke's doing. I'm just kind of giving a pie in the sky example as to how that would work. And so to me, what's the point of all this? Let the schools pay, because right now donors and the schools are having to deal with this. They're going, the donor used to give the money to the school, and they weren't saying, okay, well, don't pay the coach with this money. This should go here. And the money was a tax write-off. Now they're saying, well, how much should I give to the school, and how much do I need to give to the collective for player acquisition? It's tiresome for donors. There is going to be donor fatigue at some point, but that's all part of the business. So, at some point, I think the schools are going to wise up and say, look, it's so much easier. Just let the donors give it to us, and we'll pay the players. It's the more efficient way to do it. Nobody would come up with this system absent the ridiculous restrictions on athletes that the NCAA puts in. If they were allowed to do what they wanted to do, it would be way more efficient. And would they overpay for one player? Maybe. Would they underpay for another and get a great deal? Maybe. But you see them do that with coaches all the time. I mean, nobody threw their arms up saying we have to stop this when Jimbo Fisher got fired and they owed him $70 million. And then the boosters marshaled those resources to pay him and get rid of him, and then hire another coach at the same amount. Where's all the Title IX problems and people worrying about canceling sports when that happened? They're not worried about that. All these problems are made up. Schools are going to do what's in their best interests, and they'll figure it out just fine if they're allowed to, and they need to be allowed to.
Jay, that is awesome. I'm going to leave it at that. But just before we finish, I'd like to just extend my best wishes to your colleague and college basketball legend, Dick Vitale. He's been battling cancer, and we certainly wish him all the best. And hopefully there's a chance we'll see him on the TV at some point this season.
Yeah, I think we will. Dick has been a warrior, and he's been through a lot, but there's nobody better in our business, and nobody's done more for the V Foundation or for the sport than Dick Vitale is. You're absolutely right. He's a legend among legends.
Yeah, he is. Jay, all the best to you and your family. Thank you so much. We hope you have a great year.
Thank you, Chris. Great to be with you.